The morning the sale barn ran out of empty pens, Eddie Mallory hauled in one cow. Not a trailer full, not a dispersal herd, one cow. She was 12 years old, sway-backed, open from the spring breeding, and she limped when she stepped off the trailer. The men leaning on the pipe rails at the Cedar County Livestock Exchange looked at Eddie's pickup, then looked behind it, waiting for the second trailer. There was no second trailer. That was October of 1973, and cattle money in northeast Nebraska had gone crazy enough to make careful men sound like gamblers. Finished steers were bringing numbers the older ranchers said out loud only after they checked them twice. Buyers from Iowa, Colorado, and western Kansas had been showing up before daylight, filling the first 2 rows of the auction seats with clean hats, checkbooks, and the kind of confidence that makes a farmer distrust his own math. That fall, 31 cow-calf operators in Cedar County sold all or nearly all of their breeding cows. Eddie Mallory sold 1. The auctioneer, Merle Voss, had been selling cattle in that ring since 1959. He had already called 7 full herd liquidations that week. Eddie's old cow came through the gate by herself. Merle paused just long enough to look down from the block. He did not smile. He did not say a word. He just nodded once. Because every man in that barn knew what Eddie was refusing. And only one man in that barn knew why. 6 years earlier, in the spring of 1967, Eddie's father had handed him the cow herd behind a red plank calving shed 3 miles north of Laurel, Nebraska. His father's name was Harold Mallory. He was 57 years old, narrow-shouldered, slow-moving, and hard to hurry. He had spent 40 years on 640 acres of dryland corn, alfalfa, native grass, and shelter-belt pasture that his own father had pieced together after the First World War. The herd was not large. 91 Hereford and Shorthorn cross cows, 3 bulls, and a black ledger kept in the tack room in a flour sack so the mice would not chew the corners. Every cow had a number. Every calf had a weight. Every open cow had a mark beside her page. And Harold believed that one honest mark in a ledger was worth more than a long story at the elevator. That morning, Harold walked Eddie through the cows one by one. He pointed to cow 18, a red-faced cow with a white splash above the left eye, and said she had weaned 7 calves without needing help. He pointed to cow 53, short-bodied and ugly, and said she was the kind of cow a fool would sell because she did not photograph well. Then he pointed to cow 77, who had lost a calf in the March storm of 1965, bred back clean, and made up for it the next year. Eddie was 24. He had been waiting to run the place since he was old enough to hold a sorting stick. He thought the handoff would be about confidence, or ownership, or maybe some final speech about hard work. It was not. Harold stopped inside the calving shed, pulled a folded seed invoice from his shirt pocket and wrote one sentence on the back of it with a carpenter's pencil. Then he pinned it above the light switch. The sentence said, "A record price is not a plan. It is weather. Weather moves." Harold tapped the paper once with the pencil. He said, "You will be tempted to call a high bid wisdom. Don't." Then he handed Eddie the ledger, the ear tag pliers, and the herd. Harold had seen 2 cattle peaks before Eddie was born, and one when Eddie was still in school. He had watched neighbors sell good cows because a buyer waved a number high enough to make it feel like Providence. He had also watched those same men try to buy cows back 2 years later. When the money was gone, the herd was gone, and every replacement heifer in the county cost too much. Eddie heard the warning in 1967. He understood it later. By 1973, that sentence above the light switch had turned yellow at the edges. The country was hot with inflation. Feeders were bidding like beef could only go one direction. At the sale barn, cattle were not walking through the ring so much as being swallowed by money. Good cows, tired cows, bred heifers, thin pairs. Anything with 4 legs and a hide was bringing a number that made men slap their thighs and say, "You can't pass that up." Eddie's neighbor, Wayne Braddock, did not pass it up. Wayne was 42, broad through the chest, quick with figures, and not careless. He ran 118 black baldy cows on 400 acres east of town, and he knew his cost of production better than most men knew their birthdays. In September of 1973, Wayne sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Marlene, and did the arithmetic on a yellow pad. If he sold the herd near the top, he could clear the banknote, put money down on the used combine, and tear up the south pasture for corn. Grain prices were strong. The county banker liked the plan. The weekly paper liked the plan. Half the coffee row liked the plan. Wayne told Eddie about it one morning at the co-op while they were both waiting on mineral. He said, "Eddie, I can sell those cows for more than they earned me in the last 3 years combined." Eddie said, "That may be true." Wayne said, "I'd be a fool not to take it." Eddie looked at the loading dock, then at the sacks of mineral stacked against the wall. He said, "A high bid can make a man feel like he has been thinking. Sometimes he has only been listening." Wayne laughed, not meanly. He said, "Your dad always talked in barn signs." Eddie said, "He lived long enough to need them." Wayne sold his herd in 2 dispersal sales in October, cleared just over $109,000 after commission, paid the bank, bought the combine, rented another 80 acres, and put seed corn where his cows had grazed the year before. The Cedar County Messenger ran a front-page story about local cattlemen capturing the historic beef market. There was a photograph of Wayne standing in the sale barn alley, one boot on the lower rail, looking like a man the future had chosen. Eddie cut that article out. Not because he agreed with it, because he wanted to remember how convincing the wrong day can look. 2 weeks after Wayne's first sale, Eddie loaded the old open cow and drove to the same barn. Men asked him if the rest of his cows were coming later. Eddie said no. One man told him he was leaving money in the pasture. Another said a man only sees prices like this once. Eddie said, "Maybe that's the problem." His old cow brought more than she deserved. Merle Voss called her clean, dropped the hammer, and nodded from the block. That was all. By January, the weather moved. Beef demand softened. Feed costs stayed ugly. Interest tightened. The same buyers who had leaned forward in October sat back in their seats. By March, good cattle were bringing enough less that the men who had waited too long stopped calling it a correction and started calling it a lesson. Eddie had not sold, but that did not make the winter easy. The hardest night came in February of 1974 at the kitchen table with the light over the stove buzzing and a stack of bills beside the coffee pot. Eddie's wife, Ruth, had been keeping the household books in a spiral notebook. She was not a worrier, and that was why Eddie listened when she spoke. She said they could sell 20 cows in the spring and still keep a workable herd. The north fence needed rebuilding. The hay mower needed parts. The bank would like seeing cash instead of cows. She did not push. She just put the numbers on the table. Eddie stared at them for a long time on the table. Eddie stared at them for a long time. The temptation was not greed anymore. That was what made it dangerous. It sounded like caution. It sounded like being responsible. It sounded like fixing a fence before it failed, and sleeping better because the banker had one less reason to ask questions. Near midnight, Eddie got up and walked to the calving shed. The air was cold enough to make the boards pop. A heifer shifted in the straw. The cows outside were dark shapes against the lot light. Eddie checked the water, checked the heifer, and then stopped inside the door. The seed invoice was still pinned above the switch. A switch. A record price is not a plan. It is weather. Weather moves. Eddie stood there with his hand on the pull chain. That night he understood the second half, the part his father had not written down. Weather moves both ways. If a man sells the factory because the day is bright, he still has to live through the next storm without a factory. In the morning, Eddie told Ruth he was not selling the 20 cows. Ruth nodded once. She said, "I only wanted to know you had counted them." He said, "I counted them." The next several years did not reward Eddie with drama. They rewarded him with calves. That is slower, but it lasts longer. The 1974 calf crop was light, but it sold. The 1975 crop was better. In 1976, The cows paid for the north fence in small checks, not one grand check. In 1977, Eddie replaced the hay mower without borrowing against the herd. Wayne's corn years were more exciting. Some were good, some were not. The combine note did not care which was which. Neither did the interest on rented ground. The south pasture that had once held his cows now had rows on it, and when the rows failed, there was nothing standing at the gate to make a calf next spring. By the early 1980s, interest had turned mean. Land that looked cheap in the glow of 1973 did not look cheap when operating money cost what it cost. Wayne refinanced once, then again. He sold the rented equipment first. Then he sold the 80 acres he had added. Then he hired on part-time at the feed mill for winter income and told people he was only doing it until grain came back. Grain did come back, but not in a way that rebuilt a cow herd. That is the part men forget when they sell breeding stock. You can sell cows in 2 afternoons. You cannot build a good cow herd in 2 afternoons. You need years of culling, years of keeping heifers, years of learning which cow raises a calf in a bad summer, and which one only looks good beside the bunk. In 1983, drought hit Cedar County hard enough to make the corn leaves roll before noon. Rain split around the county for 6 weeks like it had a grudge. The creek behind Wayne's old south pasture went to puddles. Dryland corn fired from the bottom up. Eddie's place suffered too. He started feeding hay in August. The native grass on the West 80 cured early. Calves weaned lighter than they should have. Ruth wrote smaller numbers in the notebook, and Eddie did not pretend they were larger. But Harold had insisted on 2 things Eddie used to think were excessive: deep well maintenance and 1 full extra year of hay under roof. Those 2 habits did not look smart in wet years. They looked expensive. In 1983, they looked like water and feed. Eddie sold every calf that fall. Not at a bragging price. Not at a newspaper price. The herd came through thin, but it came through alive. Wayne finished that year with crop insurance paperwork, an operating note, and the first honest sentence he had said about 1973. He said, "I sold the only part of my farm that could stand up and walk through a bad year." 9 years after the record fall, Wayne drove into Eddie's yard on a gray November afternoon. Eddie was sorting bred heifers for preg check, and the lot was loud with bawling and steel gates. Wayne got out of the pickup without shutting the door all the way. Eddie handed him a sorting stick, because cattlemen can talk better when their hands have work. Cattlemen can talk better when their hands have work. They sorted 3 heifers before Wayne spoke. He said, "I have been mad at that sale for 9 years. Eddie said, "The sale didn't make you sell." Wayne nodded. He said, "No, it just made selling feel like proof." They worked another gate. Then Wayne said, How did you keep yours?" Eddie did not answer right away. He pushed the red heifer through, shut the latch, and looked toward the calving shed. He said, "My father taught me the difference between a price and a pattern." Wayne waited. Eddie said, "A price is what a buyer will pay you today because of what he believes today. Pattern is what a cow will do across 10 years if you do not interrupt her." Wayne looked at the heifers. Eddie said, "In 1973, you read the price. My father made me read the pattern." Wayne asked to see the sign. They walked to the calving shed. The paper above the light switch had gone brittle. The pencil mark was faded, but it was still readable because Eddie had traced over it once, lightly, in 1978, and then never touched it again. A record price is not a plan. It is weather. Weather moves. Wayne read it twice. Then he said, "Weather moves both ways." Eddie said, "That is the part a man has to learn for himself." By 1994, Eddie was 51 years old. The herd was 94 cows. The home place was still 640 acres. The ledger was still in the tack room, though the flour sack had been replaced twice. His daughter, Claire, 23, had come home after 2 years of ag college and was riding calf weights in a straighter hand than his. Harold had died the previous winter. He was buried in the little cemetery west of town, the one with cedar trees bent from north wind. Eddie took the ledger there once in April, not because Harold could read it, but because Eddie needed to say the numbers out loud. Since 1967, the Mallory herd had produced a little more than 2,400 weaned calves. Some years paid well, some years barely paid. Several years looked foolish until the next one arrived. But the herd had paid taxes, paid fences, paid machinery repairs, paid groceries, paid the bank, and paid for the next set of cows by raising them. Wayne Braddock's place still had good soil. It still had a house, a machine shed, and rows that came up when the weather cooperated. But he had no cowherd left to hand his son. His son worked parts at the implement dealer in Norfolk and came home on Sundays. That is not a moral failure. It is just what a permanent decision can do when it is made under temporary weather. In the fall of 1994, cattle prices began climbing again. Not exactly like 1973. They never repeat exactly. They just rhyme well enough to fool new men and remind old ones. At the co-op, someone asked Eddie if this was the year to sell heavy. Eddie looked at Claire, then looked at the younger man asking the question. He said, "When the buyers come early, when the paper calls it historic, and when the banker starts praising men for selling cows, remember this." He pointed toward his place, though they were 3 miles away from it. He said, "The cow is the asset. The bid is only the weather." That evening, Claire stood in the calving shed and read her grandfather's sentence above the switch. Eddie watched her read it, and for the first time he understood why Harold had pinned it instead of just saying it. A spoken warning belongs to the man who heard it. A written warning waits for the next one. Claire took a new seed tag from the shelf, turned it over, and wrote one line beneath her grandfather's sentence. Weather moves, the herd remains. She pinned it with the same 2 tacks. The next spring, cow 41 calved unassisted in the north lot. Her heifer weighed 76 pounds at birth and 528 pounds at weaning. Claire wrote it in the ledger under Eddie's numbers, under Harold's numbers, under the older ink from men she had never met. That is how a farm stays a farm. Not by catching the loudest price, not by being blind to money, not by pretending markets do not matter. A farm stays a farm by knowing which things are weather and which things are roots. The men who sold at the top in 1973 did not all fail. Some did fine. Some were lucky. Some were better grain farmers than they had been cattlemen. But the men who sold good cow herds because the number looked too high to refuse traded a living machine for a disappearing number. Eddie Mallory did not beat the market. He outlasted the mood of it. The record bid moved on. The cows bred back, the calves hit the ground, kept filling, and above the light switch, 2 pieces of paper kept telling the same quiet truth. A record price is not a plan, it is weather. Weather moves, the herd remains. Subscribe to the Farm Ledger. The next story is about a farmer who refused to tear down an old hedge windbreak in 1980, while every neighbor said it was stealing yield. 5 years later, when the black blizzard came across the county, they found out what that hedge had really been earning.